Or on the left of everybody. So I might begin. So I'd like to welcome everyone into this morning's webinar. My name is Jess Booth. I'm the Education and Research Coordinator with the Columbia Shuswap Invasive Species Society. We're also joined by Anna, who is our Program Assistant. Today we will be facilitating our webinar on invasive fish with our guest presenter, Andrew Gus, will be sharing some of his work on Gus and yellow perch. So a lot of information and some interesting pieces to share. So we won't take up too much of your time with our chat, but I do want to acknowledge that the region in which you work is the unceded homelands of the Snarks, Tanaha, Chukwetnik, and Swales, who've cared for this land, the water, and living things amongst it since time immemorial. We also just invite you to share where you're zooming in from today in the chat, just so we get an idea on where we're coming from, and if you'd like to share the territories on which you're coming from, that would be great. And let me know if there's any pieces of sound or this at all. Hopefully it all goes well. And just some housekeeping today. Myself will be available to help. Just pop any notes in the chat. Emma is also going to be helping us too. If you've got any questions, pop them in there as the presentation is going, and we'll get to them at the end. We'll also have some time if you have anything you want to chat about or ask Andrew. So please feel free to shout out, turn yourself off mute when that time comes. If you can, keep the microphones muted and the videos as you are doing, that's great. So just to create some feedback as we go. And this presentation will also be recorded. I'll put it up on our YouTube channel probably later today, and Andrew will send the slides as well. So they'll all be there for us to check. So I'll just briefly mention CSISS, who we are, what we do. And this is a picture of last year. We celebrated our 10th year of being an environmental profit and operating in our region. We are dedicated to the prevention, management, and reduction of invasive species in the Columbia Shuswap Regional District. And I hope this is all working for you. The slides are up to date. Our purpose is to educate and engage people about invasive species and their impacts, to establish and operate invasive species management program. And some of these pictures here, there's some fun ones of our Perch program. There's Emma up in the top there treating some like iris, putting in some barriers. We do weed pools workshops, and then we also have a field program that heads out monitoring invasive plants and doing surveys, and we also sample for zebra and carbon mussels, which is pictured in the bottom corner as well. I'm not sure if the next slide is going for you, hopefully. So CSISS is one of many organizations across BC. We operate in a smaller region of this, in the Columbia Shuswap Regional District, but if you're calling in from other places today, these are the many groups that you can get a hold of. In a follow-up email, I have a link here, and I think Emma might be able to share it in the chat as well. There we go. Thanks, Emma. And so we work together on a lot of different projects, but if you have questions specifically something in your region, they're the best contacts to go. And so our area of operation, that we go from Field, and then all the way over to Falkland in the west and north to Mica Creek. And throughout that area, we sort of break it to different invasive plant management areas. So we host a land manager meeting every year, and that's where we discuss and prioritize different species in the region, input from governments and land managers who work in the region. And these are set by a variety of different priorities, but our land manager next land manager meeting is coming up next Thursday. So there's a registration link to which I'll put in a follow-up emails. So what are invasive species? I'll give a very brief overview. I feel like a lot of the people in the call are probably quite familiar with invasive species, so I won't go into too much detail, but invasive species are any non-native organism that causes economic, social, or environmental harm. They can spread quickly to new areas of the city or the area they arrived at. They adversely affect and cause damage to the habitats they invade. So there's a few characteristics that invasive species have that allow them to outcompete native species, such as fast growth, rapid reproduction, especially for plants. A lot of plants produce a large number of seeds and have high dispersal. Some invasive species, such as birds or flying insects, are able to disperse really far and wide due to their own biology. But we find a lot of species, especially invertebrates and plants, fish, are assisted by humans and either transported accidentally or on purpose to new areas. So they are super adaptable in these new areas and can tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions. So they may not have the pathogens or predators that existed in their previous environment. And so next I will hand over to Andrew Klassen. He is our guest speaker today. He brings over 16 years of experience as a senior fish theories biologist for the Fish and Wildlife Branch in the Thompson region. And he's been engaged in conservation and management of aquatic ecosystems, especially in invasive fish and small lake management. As a fisheries biologist at the provincial government, his work has allowed him to focus on implementing strategies for preserving native fish species and combating the spread and growth of some illegally introduced invasive fish species, as bass and fish. So I'll hand over to Andrew. I'll stop my share of my screen and I'll get Andrew to share this.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Jess. Let me get my screen here. Let's make sure this is right. Okay. So can you see it there? And let me go to slideshow here. Does that look good?
Perfect, thank you.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again for having me here. I know I've worked with a number of you in the past, and yeah, so most of my experience working for the government is working on invasive fish species. So I started in 2008, and at that time, the position was advertised as kind of an invasive fish biologist. And so that's kind of how I started. And so what I'm going to do today is give you guys a bit of an update on our fisheries region, some of the things that we do, and then really dive into the invasive fish part of things. So yeah, so the Thompson region, which is the area that I manage, the province is broken down into a number of units that we manage as the Fish and Wildlife Branch. The Thompson region, which is our region, it's our centers from Kamloops. We have about 1,200 lakes with sport fish in them. And so these are lakes with rainbow trout, kokanee, brook trout, bull trout. We stock about 200 lakes in this area as well for conservation and for creating fisheries. And the Thompson region is really the #1 fishing destination in the province. So people come to Kamloops and the surrounding areas, Shuswap, to angle for fish. And this brings a lot of revenue into the area. And so our regional fisheries support about 800,000 angler days. So an angler day is defined as someone fishing for 4 hours on a lake. And that generates about 100 to 150 million annually in indirect revenue. So most of that is, gas to get here, hotel stays, fishing gear. A small part of that would be fishing licenses as well, but it's a pretty big driver of the local economy. And so our program has 3 objectives. The first objective is to conserve wild fish and their habitats. And so that's the overarching thing that we're always striving for. The second piece is to ensure there is food fishery, food and social and ceremonial fishery for First Nations. And then thirdly is to provide recreational opportunities based on the resources that we have. And so these are kind of the program objectives that we work under, and they kind of guide all the work we do. So the Thompson region, I was just talking earlier, but we have 3.5 biologists to look after this. So we're stretched pretty thin. But one of the things that we really focused on the last 10 years was invasive fish because of the impacts that we were seeing from those species. So just to talk about some of the values that we do have, I just have an example here, the Thompson River steelhead. So this is kind of a world-renowned steelhead fishery on the Thompson River. The numbers have been declining over time. So this is us tagging the fish. We actually radio tag a number of these fish every year and then track where they go. But this graph here shows the abundance of these fish over time. And we've really seen a pretty sharp decrease in the abundance of Thompson River steelhead, to the point where we only have about 200 fish coming back. And so obviously there's lots of things that are causing this, but one of them, that could compound this issue would be invasive fish species. And so it just shows you that we have a lot of pressures on our fishery stocks, and if we can remove invasive fish as one of them, that's really what we want to do. Another cool fish that we have is the burbot. So these are burbot from Nicola Lake. We've been doing a study looking at their populations, and there are concerns now, and I'll get into that later, about yellow perch being in Nicola Lake and some of the unknown impacts that they may have on burbot. So it kind of all started in the late 90s. So there has been bass and perch in British Columbia for over 80 years, and especially in the Okanagan area, bass have been there for quite a while. Bass and perch are not native to BC. They are native east of the Rockies, and in the southern portion of the United States. But they have been here for quite a while, and they were all brought here by people who've illegally moved them to fish for them. And so bass and perch do provide angling opportunities. If you watch TV, you see those bass fishing shows, you see, all these people fishing for these species. And so I think the intention was people would stock them in lakes within our province, and then they could angle for them. And so there's a long history of this. The Thompson region, so our region remained the last southern drainage in the province not to have these established populations. The Okanagan had them, the Lower Mainland had them, the Kootenays has them, but we didn't have them. And we first discovered them in some lakes in the Kamloops area in 1996. And nothing was done for a while. We were quite shocked that this had happened, but we weren't really sure what to do. And so by 2005, there were 9 lakes that had established populations of perch and bass. All 9 lakes had yellow perch, and some of them had small and largemouth bass, and actually sunfish as well. And so this was quite concerning. I was actually a student in 2005, and I did a project for the ministry on invasive fish, and that's kind of how I kind of got started working with the ministry. But I started full-time in 2007, and kind of jumped into this project. And so 5 of these 9 lakes had direct connection to the Thompson, most of them to the Shuswap. And so they had creeks that flowed out of them into the Shuswap. And we were quite concerned about these fish spreading. And so at this point, we decided we needed to do something to try to stop the spread and to try to remove these populations. Because even if we stop the spread and contain them in these lakes, unfortunately, people still move them. And it's illegal to move live fish in BC. If you catch a fish during angling, you have to release it immediately or kill it and keep it for consumption. But people were putting them in buckets and moving them from these lakes. And I think the fine is up to $200,000 or up to 6 months in jail for moving live fish. That being said, they've never fined someone more than $200 for this. So there's an enforcement issue as well. But what we did is we secured funding for, we called it the Spiny Ray Eradication Program, and we initiated that in 2006. And so these are the species that we are talking about. So we have smallmouth bass, we have yellow perch, largemouth bass, pumpkin seed sunfish, and actually we have goldfish in a lot of lakes around the salmon arm area and around Kamloops. And so the unfortunate part about the goldfish is that the movement of live fish pertains to fish native or non-native fish caught during angling, but the pet trade's a bit of a gray area. People can purchase fish at the pet store and transport them pretty much wherever they want, right? And it's illegal to introduce them into the wild, obviously, but it's a ready supply of fish that people can get. And so I'm going to dive into a bit more onto ID of some of these species. So the first one is the yellow perch. And as I mentioned, this is the one that we had in all 9 lakes. We suspect people stock bass and perch in most of these lakes. Perch are a preferred food for bass, and they likely stock them together. In some of these lakes, I think the bass just didn't take, and the perch really did. And so, yeah, so this is what a yellow perch looks like. When we talk about spiny ray fish, this is what we're talking about. And so perch have a 2-part dorsal fin, and the first part of it is quite spiky. You can see those spikes on it there, and that's the spiny ray family of fish have these spiky front dorsal fin lobe. And none of our native fish in BC have that, and so that's a really telltale sign that's an invasive fish. And it's split into 2 parts. The back part is quite a soft fin ray, and so it's can distinguish from that way. The other kind of the major thing is they're this yellowish color with these 7 vertical bars of brown or olive. Some can have less than 7 or more sometimes, but generally it's 7 kind of stripes coming down the side. Again, none of our native fish have coloration like that. And this distinct body shape, so especially perch, the larger perch, when you see them, they have this kind of hump behind their head in front of the dorsal fin. That's kind of another telltale sign of perch. The one that people sometimes mistake for bass or perch is our native pike minnow. They have similar coloration without the stripes and a large kind of mouth, but they don't have the spiky fin on the top, and the body shape is a little bit different. And then this bright orange pelvic fin, so that's another telltale sign of a perch. And it's quite obvious when you see them with that bright colored fin. The other thing that we always look for, and sometimes this is easier to spot than the perch themselves, in the spring, this is what the perch eggs look like. And so the first time I saw this, I thought it was some kind of plastic bag on the bottom of the lake. But the way perch spawn is they drape these ribbons of eggs on woody debris or vegetation around the shoreline, sometimes quite shallow. You can see it in the shallows of the lake. But sometimes it's easier to spot this than the perch themselves. And so what we suggest is if people see this or see perch, but especially these egg masses, if you can take a picture, and it's not always easy through the water, but it's a way for us to help identify if they are in that area. So that's the yellow perch. The other species that we did spend some time working on and trying to control also was the bass species. We mostly had smallmouth bass in the Kamloops area. We did have one lake with largemouth as well. And so bass have this large chunky body shape. They also have a very similar dorsal fin with that sharp spiky fin in the front and that softer lobe in the back. So to distinguish between the 2 bass species, the largemouth bass has this larger mouth that extends usually past the eye, and it's quite protruding. The smallmouth has a small, hence the name, has a smaller mouth. You can see the mouth does not protrude past, the end of the eye. So that's one way to tell them apart. The operculum plate, so this kind of the back of the head here, you can see it extends. The gills are further back on the largemouth and a little closer to the front on the smallmouth. Coloration's another big thing. The largemouth generally have this darker stripe down the middle of a greenish body, where the smallmouth are usually quite brown in color or bronzy with kind of more vertical darker stripes. And so yeah, and also generally the smallmouth has a bit of a red eye. It's actually quite striking sometimes. You can see the red eye where the largemouth generally doesn't have that. So we do have a number of lakes in the Kootenays and in the Okanagan area that still have these species. But yeah, that's just a kind of quick summary of what they look like. And so here's a bit of a map. And so this shows the areas where these fish were found. And so you can see it's quite spread out around the Shuswap area, around kind of Salmon Arm, Chase area. The red stars only had perch, and the green ones had bass and perch. And it's interesting, like, how did they get there, right? And obviously, there's no connection between these water bodies. These were moved by people, and these are moved by people that wanted to angle for these. And so one of the things that we did very quickly was we closed these lakes to fishing. And so people often suggest, oh, why not allow people to catch a ton and help reduce the numbers? And you could probably reduce the numbers slightly, but you're never going to get rid of them that way. And you're just going to make these fisheries popular, and you're going to leave it open for people to move fish. And so we closed all of them except for Gardam, because there was some pressure from the local angling community to continue to leave Gardam open because it was one of the only fishing lakes in the area. But within a year, we had 3 movements out of Gardam Lake, and we moved to close that one as well. The little yellow dot you can see in the top left corner here on Adams Lake, we actually found perch in Adams Lake as well. And what had happened is they'd been able to leave Forest Lake and get to Adams Lake before we could treat or contain them in forest. So they were discovered in Adams Lake 1 year. 13 fish were caught, and that was in, I think, 2008 or 2009, and we've never found another one, which is really, really odd. Generally, once they've moved to a new area, they really take over. Not to say there isn't perch in Adams, but we just have never had another report of them since then. So that was kind of encouraging. And so why are they a problem? And so, these species are not native to our region. They don't have predators here that they typically would in their home range, which Jess kind of touched on earlier under the definition of invasive species. And they're very good predators. And so these are stomach contents that we got from some bass. And you can see these bass are eating full-size adult dragonflies, full adult frogs, salamanders, and even a small mammal. This is a shrew here on the bottom right-hand side. So we were starting to see major impacts to the local ecosystems of these lakes. And it was not only these larger things, we were seeing a real reduction in the aquatic invertebrates for our native species. And so lakes where we had perch, they quickly exploded in population. And these lakes had native rainbow trout in them. And within 5 years, we couldn't find the trout anymore. And these perch were able to outcompete and probably prey on the juvenile rainbows as well, but they were able to outcompete our native species. We started seeing this on all the lakes with these species. Gardam Lake's another example where, there used to be quite a large population of tree frogs. When we did our surveys before we were able to remove the bass and perch, we found 3 tree frogs in a like 2-day survey. And so that was quite concerning. So we knew there was a problem. We knew we needed to do something. What were we going to do? And so for the first full year of my job was just looking at options for invasive species control and management. And lots of stuff's been tried across the world, across North America, different options for trying to remove invasive species. And fish are particularly hard. You can't see them. When you're working with plants, at least you can see them. And fish are, underwater, it's really hard to survey what you actually have. And so we started looking at different methods. People suggested, like I mentioned before, angling. Why not allow people to catch them? We've talked about that. That's a problem. It creates an incentive for people to angle for these things. And why would somebody drive 3 hours to a lake when they could move them to a lake closer to their house? So that wasn't a great option. We looked at mechanical trapping, so trap nets or netting, and that had been done in a number of places. And it's really good at reducing the population, but not completely removing it. And the problem with that kind of control is you would have to do it forever to stay on top of those populations. A perch can lay up to 50,000 eggs in a year, so leaving a handful of perch would have you back where you started very quickly. People suggested biological control. So there are viruses that affect certain species of fish. Why not just try to get one that was specific to perch or bass? And that has scary implications. We don't want to mess with bringing something here that might affect our native species. Another biological control would be introducing pike or another species to work on and control these. And again, that has its own issues. The one thing that has worked is completely dewatering lakes. And so if you had the ability to, if it was a reservoir and you could drain it, that could work. But most of these were large natural lakes that didn't have that ability. The other option is a chemical treatment. And this is something that has been done across North America for over 80 years. And it was the only method that we could find in the literature that would have a complete removal of these species. So these other methods could control them, but you couldn't remove them. And so we started pursuing and looking at the option of doing a rotenone treatment. And so in BC, we have done rotenone treatments since the 1940s. They've done more than 170 lakes within the province with a number of different products. These were done in the past to remove non-salmonid species like suckers and shiners to create salmonid fisheries. We stopped doing that in the 1980s. We realized as an agency that removing those native species wasn't the right thing to do just to create fisheries. And the public really thought the same thing. The public didn't agree with us killing native fish to create fisheries. And so we really, and that was much before my time, but we stopped doing that. So we hadn't done a treatment with rotenone since I think 1983 was the last one we did. So we really needed to look at the options for permitting this, and we really needed to convince the public and other agencies that it was important and that the short-term impacts of a rotenone treatment were much better than the long-term biological impacts of invasive fish. And so for the first couple of years of my job, I hosted, I think, about 20 public meetings. We met with First Nations groups. We met with local residents, fish and game, naturalists, different community groups. We really needed to sell the issue of invasive species and show people the impacts they were having. So for the first year, I don't even think we talked about solutions. We just talked about the problem. And then slowly we started saying, hey, these are the options you could use. And by the end of these public meetings, we really had the public in full support of the idea of a rotenone treatment. And so we started moving forward with looking into the permitting side of things. And so this is a picture of Gardam Lake. And it looks a little crazy. Everyone's wearing hazmat suits and that's just for the protection of the applicators. Rotenone's interesting. So rotenone is made from a crushed up plant root from the legume family. It was discovered by the indigenous people of South America, and they used it as a food gathering method. So they'd crush up the plant root, they'd put it in the water, and the way it works is it blocks the fish from basically using oxygen in cellular respiration. And so it really only impacts gill-breathing organisms. So almost very specifically fish. There's some small impacts to the aquatic invertebrates that are still in the water, like dragonflies and stuff, but I'll talk about it later. We monitored that stuff very carefully. And so we started planning, and it took about a year of my time to do permits, to get emergency permits from Health Canada, Interior Health, because we needed to import rotenone from the US because we weren't using it in Canada. And so each treatment took about a year of my time to plan. And this is kind of what it looks like. So we would have these barrels of product, and we would release it into the lake at super low concentrations at like 2 parts per million. So it's like a tenth of the amount of chlorine they put in your drinking water if they have chlorine in drinking water. So it's a very, very small amount, and it's very effective on fish. Within 12 hours, every fish in the lake is dead. And the important thing that we needed to do was we needed to make sure there was no areas of refuge, small little springs or creeks coming in, because if there's any fresh water, The fish will find those areas, and if you leave 10 perch, in 5 years, you're back where you started. And this project cost a lot of money. I think we spent on all the lakes we treated about $1.5 million. And that money came from outside of government. So a big part of my job was to write grants and proposals to agencies outside of the government to get this funding. And the majority, I'd say 95% of the funding came from the Habitat Conservation Trust Fund, which is a outside of government agency that supplies money to groups that are looking to do different kinds of environmental work. So just another picture of the applicators, and everybody said, "Oh, this looks quite scary," because they have to wear these suits. But there are protocols we need to follow on the product labels, and this is what we need to do to ensure that our applicators were safe. On all these lakes, a lot of them had drinking water. People were drinking this water, and so based on the amount of rotenone we were putting in, we actually didn't need to supply drinking water, but we did. We supplied drinking water to everybody on these lakes for about 2 months after treatment. Rotenone has a really short half-life, and it disappears and gets broken down biologically really quickly. And then the results. This is what we saw. Like I mentioned, within 12 hours, we have thousands of dead perch. And if you look really closely on the top left, you can see a tiny little trout tail sticking out there. That was the one trout left in Scamana Lake after we did the treatment. But it really just shows that these perch take over very quickly. And as their populations explode, they become quite stunted and small. So success. We treated all 9 lakes. We did that over a 5-year period. We did follow-up monitoring on all of the lakes in the years following. We didn't find any of the invasive species anymore, and these treatments were deemed a success. Part of the program also involved restocking our native species back into the lakes with amazing results. When you remove these perch and we left the lakes kind of fallow for a year to recover, when you put the native fish back in, their populations it was amazing the size of the fish that we were seeing. So we had amazing production, and it just really highlighted how much these populations were repressed by the perch being in the lakes and the bass. And so a big part of what we were doing, we wanted to ensure that our rotenone treatments weren't impacting the amphibians and the reptiles, any red or blue listed species, the aquatic invertebrates, which at times of their lives are gill breathing, the zooplankton, the water quality. So we assessed all these things in great detail before our treatments and for a number of years after our treatments. And it was really great. For the amphibians and reptiles, we saw 0 impact. So at the time of year when we're doing our treatments is in the fall. The tadpoles have metamorphosed into adults. At that point, they aren't breathing with gills, and they weren't impacted at all. So population levels of those actually increased after treatment. So at Gardam Lake, 3 years after our treatment, I got a letter from one of the residents, and she'd been against the treatment, and she'd been one of the only ones that had been against it. And she wrote me a letter of apology saying, "Hey, this is the best thing that's ever happened to our lake. The amphibians have returned. There was a short-term impact from this treatment to the invertebrates, but we've seen them all explode in population." And so that was great to see. We also initiated a 3-year study on Scamana Lake with Thompson Rivers University looking at the invertebrates. We saw full recovery of all invertebrate populations within about 6 months. We also did a study on painted turtles on Scamana Lake with TRU and radio tracked and followed the turtles before and after treatment. And the only impacts that we saw was just the boat traffic from the treatment. There was no impact to their health or size, which was great to see. So we also realized, this wasn't about removing the fish, it was about preventing people from bringing them back. And so we started a pretty heavy educational campaign with brochures and signage. We had a reward out there for any information leading to the arrest of someone who was moving invasive species. So there's a $20,000 reward. We hoped some ex-wife would turn in her husband or something, but we didn't get that. There was a number of different campaigns on education, and the unfortunate part about invasive species is you can educate 99% of the people, but it just takes one person with a bucket of fish to put them back. And that was our concern. And it happened. And so we treated all these lakes, very successful. But in 2017, we got a report on Windy Lake. And so Windy Lake is in the Upper Penobscot watershed, the Upper Nicola River watershed. and there was perch found there. And we're not sure if it was a new stocking or if it was an older stocking, but it really brought the issue to a head because the watershed boundary between the Thompson and the Okanagan was about 5 kilometers from Windy Lake. And on the Okanagan side, there's a lake called Bear Lake, and it's had perch in it for probably 40 years. And in the Okanagan region, they've really managed bass and perch as a sport fish. And because they have them in so many lakes, they can't get rid of them. But in our region, we don't. And someone moved fish over that watershed boundary and put them into Windy Lake. So we moved quickly to treat Windy Lake. We did treat Windy Lake in 2018. In 2017. But then later in the fall of 2017, we were monitoring downstream of Windy Lake, and we found them 50 kilometers downstream in Sanctuary Lake. You can see on the map here, and Sanctuary is directly connected to Douglas Lake. And so, unfortunately, the following year, we found them in Douglas Lake, which is a lake that's too big for us to treat. And in more recent years, this last year, we found them now in Nicola Lake, which is much too big for us to treat. And as I talked about before, we have burbot and Nicola Lake that are a First Nations food fishery, and now we have perch in there. And I talked about the Thompson River steelhead. Nicola Lake is directly connected to the Thompson River, and we now have concerns, what are these species going to do downstream? And unfortunately, based on the size of these lakes, there's nothing we can do to remove them. I think the estimate for Douglas Lake for a rotenone treatment would be close to $7 million, and logistically would just be impossible with the resources that we have. So, we were successful in removing them from the Shuswap watershed. We don't have them in Shuswap Lake as far as we know, no perch or bass, but they are in the Nicola watershed and they are there to stay. And so this again highlights the need for us to continue our education and to try to, work with groups like CSISS to try to educate the public and really show that moving these things is not the right thing. We have since changed the regulations in our region, so it's illegal to fish for bass or perch in our entire region. So there's no incentive for people to continue to move these because it's illegal to fish for them. That's hard to enforce because we have other species in the lakes that you can fish for, but it's illegal to possess, keep, or fish for bass or perch. And we're hoping that'll help to stop any future movements. And that's all I have. I mean, this is a great picture I got AI to draw for me, but it's a picture of a rainbow trout eating a perch. And if we could train our rainbow trout to really key in on these species, maybe we could have something here. But that's all I have. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
It's great. Thank you, Andy. I learned a lot during that presentation. Also love the photographing the good image. It's let's go. It'd be pretty cool if we could change. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to share or ask with?
I've got a couple questions.
Yeah, go for it. Next.
Yeah, first off, Andrew, thanks so much for the presentation. It was super interesting. I didn't know all about what had gone on with the yellow perch and eradicating them or the attempts to. So that was really cool to hear about. I guess my two questions that I have or the things that are coming to mind is first off, how was it difficult to convince the people in the area to allow you to move forward with this treatment? And then the other one just at the end that I thought of is, do we think that having it illegal to fish for yellow perch and bass, is that helpful, or do we kind of want people to be the predator that they don't have?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, for that first part, yeah, it wasn't easy at first. And I think really showing the issue first was important. So highlighting the impact that they were having, I think, and showing the public, there was a pretty big issue with them. And then the second part is not jumping immediately to the conclusion of using rotenone, was showing them, hey, we've looked at all the research. We've looked at everything out there that people have tried. None of it has worked except for, dewatering or using rotenone. And, there was some opposition. people had concerns, right? You use the word chemical, and that's like, ooh, that's problematic. And like explaining what rotenone was and where it came from. It comes from a plant. It's been used by indigenous people. I think that all helped, but I think it was a process, right? It took years for us to get there, and by the end, surprisingly, we basically had people basically petitioning government to say, yeah, let them do this. Like we want them to do this because we realize we need to remove them completely. Control is tough, right? You can control species, you can knock them back, but unless you can remove them completely, it's just a ongoing forever thing, right? And so surprisingly, we only had one or two people in all of our treatments that were against it, and one of them apologized to me afterwards. So it was just a bit surprising, to be honest, but I think working with those groups from the beginning, working with the naturalist clubs and the community groups from the start, going through the options together, I think really got us to that point. And then for the second part, making it illegal to fish for these species, what we've seen, we get this question all the time, and where we've seen other agencies try to use angling as a control measure, it doesn't work. Angling itself, you cannot catch enough of them to really make a dent on the population. And if you do, especially with perch, if you knock their numbers back, you have fewer fish in the lake. They actually just get bigger, which is more enticing for people to fish for them, which means people are more likely to spread them. And so it really just creates an incentive for people to move them. If the angling is going to be ineffectual for actually controlling them or eradicating them, I think it's not helpful to allow people to do it. It just creates a popular fishery, and we've seen it time and time again where we've had openings, people will move them. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I hadn't thought about it, helping them grow in size and popularity. But
yeah,
thank you so much.
no problem. Any other questions?
Hey Andrew, it's Robin here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I was just wondering kind of next steps in the region. What do you think is coming down the pipeline, and what are some things that CSISS and other land managers can do to support this work? As you say, you've got limited capacity, so please give good support. And one just idea that I've been chatting about with some of the groups in the region is the impacts of invasives on species at risk. So I was also wondering if you could talk about any impacts to species at risk for some of these species.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, obviously quagga mussel is one we're really concerned about. And it seems like that has been a focus for groups like yourselves across the province, and that's really good to see. From the fish side, it is a tough one. We have goldfish showing up more and more. Unfortunately, in places like Shuswap, we already have goldfish and carp in the main systems, so it's not as critical to try to stop them. It's still important for that local ecosystem where they are being put into to try to stop that. I think working with the pet trade is going to be a big part of how we need to move forward to try to control some of that. One of the things identified kind of through some of that in Victoria was actually, I think it's the Buddhist community, a part of their, their thing is to release animals back into the wild, and they were finding they were releasing goldfish. And so the Freshwater Fishery Societies actually work with them to give them trout so they could release native species instead of invasive species. So I think in just continuing on the educational side, we do get weird reports of different fish all the time. There was a really weird one on the Shuswap. What was it? I can't remember. Some like exotic fish. I think we'll continue to see people moving. So I think groups like yourselves who can continue that educational piece, super important. Unfortunately, I hate to say it, but it feels inevitable that people will continue to move stuff. I hope we've slowed that. The other problem we're seeing is with climate change, it's harder to keep our native species alive in some lakes, and these other species would do quite well. And so, how we move forward with that, I'm not sure. But yeah, the endangered or listed species. Yeah, we don't have a lot of listed fish species. So some of concern would be like bull trout and burbot in some places. Also the steelhead. I think the issue would be more on the amphibian side. If some of these species were in like tiger salamander habitat, or even we do find they prey on western toads, which in some areas are a species of concern. Generally, they don't. Western toads have like a toxic taste. They don't taste good, so generally they don't specifically key in on them. But I think zebra mussel is another one where if in Okanagan Lake and other places that have Rocky Mountain Ridgeback mussel. If the zebra and quaggle could outcompete them, that'd be an issue. But on the fish side, we don't have a ton of concerns for red or blue listed, but it'd mostly be for like just our native species in general.
I've got another quick question on that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I thought I saw somewhere that they were saying that having yellow perch in our water bodies could potentially be a threat to like wild salmon populations. Is that something that you've heard, or is that not really of concern?
Yeah. So our agency, we don't manage salmon, but we are obviously involved with all fish. Yeah, there was some concerns. Bass and perch both would eat fish, and so in areas like Shuswap, where you have the Adams River sockeye run, there would be concerns if they established in those areas that they would have a major impact on sockeye and other salmon species. A risk assessment was done by DFO on that specifically, and they indicated that there would be an impact. It's just really hard to quantify. And in a lake like Shuswap, if bass and perch got in there, especially perch, they would occupy some of the inshore kind of weedy habitat, but it's not really that conducive to perch. They really are better adapted to really taking over these smaller lakes. Environment like Shuswap is quite competitive. Okanagan Lake has had perch for 80 years. It's tough to find one in there. So in these larger lakes with competitive environments, they don't seem to take over, but they definitely would, prey on juvenile salmon and have an impact, or eat the eggs as well. If they're shore spotting sockeye on Okanagan, or sorry, on Shuswap, for example, there would be an impact.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah.
Some great questions there. Are there any more from the audience? Might take that as a not at the moment, but if you do have some that come to you over the next little while, shoot them our way or just Andrew. We'll have a follow-up email with the contact details. But I think, yeah, an important piece for a lot of the invasive species groups that are on the call is the education piece, and I guess something to keep in mind, and how we can implement that in our programs is really useful, and really a nice addition to add to our programs. Plus, I think the piece of talking to the public, we get asked a lot of those questions in different ways. So I think having a bit more background and some info on what has been done in the past and what could work in the future, I think is really useful. I see a comment in the
I'll just add one thing. I think like when you guys are talking to your stakeholders and groups, is we get a lot of reports, we don't get a lot of pictures, and so it's really hard for us. And a lot of times what people are reporting are native species, and there's just some confusion. It really helps if we can encourage people, and it's not always easy, obviously, if you're seeing a fish in a lake and great slide there for reporting this stuff, but we get calls all the time. I caught this fish, I think it's invasive, I didn't keep it, I didn't take a picture. So just really encouraging people to get pictures of stuff would be helpful.
Yeah, we find that a lot. With all sorts of invasive species, it's really important to have a picture, especially to confirm whether it is in fact an invasive species or a native species with a western tone, because we get that throughout the spring and summer as well. Thank you so much for your time, everyone, and Andrew. I just want to note here that we have our land manager meeting coming up next week on Tuesday. It'll be held in Revelstoke at the community centre. If you aren't able to join in person, we will have a virtual link as well. And there is just a note here that we also have another invasive fish webinar coming up next week, same time, similar place on Zoom. This is a separate Zoom link. And then if you have that feedback link that's in the chat, we'd love to get your thoughts and feedback. We can share it in our organisation to host similar things in the future, learn how we can make them more enriching for you. Yeah, so we appreciate that a lot. And again, thank you, Andrew, for your time and your insights. It's been really useful for myself to see as well, and I think the others that have joined us today.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thank you so much. And that follow-up email will come through probably later today. So stay tuned for that and have a lovely day, everyone. Thank you.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Andrew. Have a great
All right.
day.
All right,
Thank
bye-bye.
you.